At 63, Margaret Ellis believed the hardest part of life was finally behind her. After working honestly for more than 4 decades, she had looked forward to a quiet retirement funded by the pension she had carefully built, one paycheck at a time. But one devastating fraud stole nearly every dollar she had saved, leaving her with little more than heartbreak and her last $250. First urged her to move in with relatives, rent a tiny apartment, and forget about starting over. Instead, she made a decision that sounded completely unreasonable. She spent her final savings buying a forgotten miller's cottage beside an abandoned watermill that most people considered nothing more than a collapsing ruin. The auction crowd couldn't believe it. Some laughed openly, saying the old cottage wasn't even worth the firewood inside it. Others joked that she would spend the rest of her retirement fixing broken walls instead of enjoying life. Margaret simply smiled, picked up the rusted key, unlocked the weathered front door, and began sweeping away decades of dust. Then, while removing loose floorboards beneath the old pantry, she uncovered a rusted iron ring hidden inside the wooden floor. Moments later, a concealed stone hatch slowly lifted, revealing something that had been hidden beneath the old mill for generations. Something that would completely rewrite the history of an entire community. But before I show you what Margaret discovered beneath that forgotten cottage, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Leave a comment below so I can say hello. And if you're starting your day with this story, I wish you good health, happiness, and a truly wonderful day ahead. And if you enjoy heartwarming mysteries, forgotten history, and inspiring stories about ordinary people who leave extraordinary legacies, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. Now, let's go back to the day Margaret lost everything and unknowingly found something far more valuable than money. Margaret Ellis had spent 42 years believing that careful planning was the safest promise anyone could make to the future. She arrived at the elementary school office before sunrise every weekday, greeted nervous parents with a reassuring smile, comforted frightened children on their first day of class, organized endless paperwork, and quietly solved problems long before anyone else noticed them. Her work was rarely celebrated, but she took pride in knowing that dependability mattered. Every paycheck followed the same routine. Bills were paid. A small amount went into savings. Another portion strengthened her retirement pension. She never dreamed of becoming wealthy. She only hoped that after decades of honest work, she would someday enjoy peaceful mornings and enough financial security to live without worrying about becoming dependent on anyone else. Those hopes vanished during the first month of her retirement several years earlier. A financial advisor recommended by longtime acquaintances had persuaded Margaret to transfer much of her pension into what appeared to be a conservative retirement investment. The statements arrived regularly. The balances looked stable. Every question she asked received calm, confident answers. Nothing suggested that the company itself existed almost entirely to deceive trusting retirees. The morning everything collapsed began like any other. Margaret switched on the television while making tea and heard the news anchor announce that federal investigators had raided multiple offices connected to a fraudulent investment operation. As photographs of familiar office buildings appeared on the screen, her teacup slipped from her hands and shattered across the kitchen floor. She recognized the company immediately. Within hours, every telephone number stopped working. Their website disappeared. News reports confirmed that retirement savings belonging to hundreds of ordinary families had been stolen through an elaborate fraud. Margaret sat quietly in her living room long after the television had fallen silent. She kept hoping another report would announce that a mistake had been made, that everyone's money had been recovered, or that her pension had somehow escaped the disaster. None of those announcements came. During the following weeks, she met with investigators, financial counselors, and attorneys. Every conversation followed nearly the same painful pattern. Records would be reviewed. Assets would be traced. Legal proceedings would continue. But recovery, if it happened at all, might take years and return only a small fraction of what had been lost. Margaret thanked everyone politely after each meeting. She understood they were doing their best. Still, every drive home felt heavier than the one before. Eventually, she accepted the reality she could no longer avoid. The pension she had spent a lifetime building was gone. She sold most of her furniture, canceled every unnecessary expense, and packed the few belongings she truly loved into neatly labeled boxes. Family photographs, several favorite books, her late husband's old pocket watch, and a small quilt her mother had sewn decades earlier mattered more than expensive possessions. Emily Carter, her niece, visited often during those difficult weeks. A graduate student studying local history and archival preservation, Emily repeatedly offered Margaret a place to stay until life became easier. Margaret appreciated the kindness, but gently declined. "You've already got enough on your shoulders," she said one evening while they packed another box. Emily smiled sadly. "Families help each other." Margaret reached over and squeezed her hand. "They do, and you've helped more than you know. But I need to find my own footing again." Emily respected her decision even though it worried her. She promised to call often and drove away only after making Margaret promise the same. Despite everything that had happened, Margaret refused to let bitterness settle into her heart. She had spent too many years encouraging frightened children to believe tomorrow could be better than today. Those words deserved to remain true for her as well. One afternoon, while waiting inside the county clerk's office to complete paperwork related to the fraud investigation, Margaret noticed a bulletin board covered with auction notices for abandoned rural properties. Most listed aging barns, storage sheds, workshops, or neglected cottages. One faded photograph immediately caught her attention. Miller's cottage beside historic watermill. Minimum bid, $250. The small stone cottage looked worn by time, with ivy climbing its walls and a weathered roof sagging slightly beneath years of neglect. Beside it stood an old watermill whose great wheel had long since stopped turning. Something about the quiet scene stirred an unexpected feeling inside her. She carefully copied the auction information before leaving the building. 3 mornings later, she drove to the county auction held at the fairgrounds. Farmers, contractors, collectors, and curious neighbors filled rows of folding chairs while the auctioneer moved briskly through tractors, equipment, abandoned buildings, and unused farmland. Margaret remained near the back, holding her bidder's card, wondering whether she had lost her mind. $250 represented almost everything she still possessed beyond daily necessities. Yet renting a small apartment would consume that money quickly. A neglected cottage at least offered the possibility of belonging somewhere again. Eventually, the auctioneer raised another property sheet. "Next item," he announced, "historic Miller's Cottage adjoining the old watermill. Property sold as is. Minimum opening bid, $250. A few people exchanged amused glances. One man laughed quietly. "That roof won't survive another winter." Another shook his head. "Watermill hasn't turned in decades. Better off tearing it down." The auctioneer waited patiently. "Opening bid?" No one answered. Margaret looked once more at the faded photograph clipped to the auction listing. The old cottage appeared tired but dignified, as though it had simply been forgotten rather than abandoned. She thought about the pension that had disappeared forever. Keeping $250 in the bank would not restore what she had lost. Slowly, before fear could change her mind, she raised her bidder's card. 250? Several people turned toward her. Someone chuckled. Guess retirement's getting adventurous. Another smiled sympathetically. Hope she knows how to rebuild stone walls. Quiet laughter spread through the crowd. Margaret lowered her card without embarrassment. She had endured far worse than strangers laughing at an old cottage. The auctioneer looked around one final time. Any higher bids? Silence followed. Sold! The gavel struck lightly against the podium. Margaret completed the paperwork, accepted an old iron key attached to a weathered wooden tag labeled Miller's Cottage, and thanked the clerk before leaving. Less than an hour later, she turned onto a narrow country road bordered by fields of tall grass and scattered wildflowers. The abandoned watermill appeared first, its great wooden wheels standing motionless above the quiet stream that had once powered it. Beside it rested the small stone cottage, sheltered beneath ancient oak trees whose branches stretched protectively across the roof. Time had left its mark everywhere. Windows were clouded with dust, the garden had disappeared beneath weeds, moss covered portions of the stone walls. Yet the cottage remained standing, with quiet determination. Margaret unlocked the front door. The hinges groaned softly as it opened into a modest kitchen smelling faintly of aged wood and dry stone. Dust coated every surface, but sunlight still found its way through the old windows. She set down her small toolbox, picked up an abandoned broom leaning against the wall, and began sweeping years of dirt from the original wooden floorboards. One room slowly became cleaner, then another. As the afternoon light shifted across the ceiling beams, something unusual caught her attention. Carved neatly into one heavy timber above the kitchen stood a simple symbol of bundled wheat, enclosed inside a small circle. Curious, she continued sweeping through the adjoining room. Another beam carried the same careful carving, then another above the pantry doorway. By the time the sun settled low beyond the old watermill, Margaret had counted the identical wheat emblem carved into several of the cottage's oldest beams, each one placed so deliberately that it seemed less like decoration and more like a quiet message left behind for someone patient enough to notice. Margaret woke before sunrise to the unfamiliar stillness surrounding the old miller's cottage. Instead of traffic outside her window, she heard water moving gently through the narrow stream that curved past the abandoned mill. The steady sound brought an unexpected sense of calm. For the first time in many weeks, she did not awaken thinking immediately about the pension she had lost. There was too much practical work waiting to be done. She brewed coffee on a small camping stove she had brought with her, unfolded a handwritten list of repairs, and began inspecting the cottage room by room. The roof appeared weathered but mostly intact. Several windows needed fresh glazing. The kitchen cupboards leaned unevenly on their hinges, and years of dampness had warped part of the pantry floor. None of it frightened her. She had learned long ago that difficult tasks became manageable when divided into small pieces. After breakfast, she drove into the nearby village to purchase cleaning supplies, nails, brushes, and replacement boards for minor repairs. At the hardware store, she introduced herself to the owner while paying for her supplies. The man asked where she had settled, and when she mentioned the miller's cottage, his eyebrows lifted with surprise. "Didn't expect anyone to buy that place," he admitted with a friendly smile. "You'll probably want Ben Lawson to look at it before you start fixing too much yourself." He scribbled a phone number onto the back of her receipt. "Best carpenter around. Honest fellow." Margaret thanked him and called the number later that afternoon. Ben Lawson arrived the following morning in a dusty pickup truck loaded with tools. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with the relaxed confidence of someone who had repaired old buildings most of his life. After introducing himself, he spent nearly an hour carefully examining the cottage without rushing. He climbed into the attic, checked the stone foundation, inspected door frames, and measured the sagging pantry floor. Finally, he set his clipboard aside. "You've actually done better than most people would think," he said. "Looks neglected, but the bones are strong. Whoever built this place knew what they were doing." Margaret smiled with visible relief. "So it isn't beyond saving?" Ben shook his head. "Not even close. It'll take work, but nothing here says impossible." Together they spent the morning replacing a few damaged boards near the back entrance and reinforcing loose supports beneath the porch. Ben explained each repair as they worked, encouraging Margaret to tackle smaller projects herself while leaving heavier structural work for later. Their easy conversation made the hours pass quickly. She appreciated that he never asked why she had bought the property or questioned whether it had been a wise decision. He simply focused on helping the cottage stand a little stronger than it had the day before. Around midday, an older man, walking slowly along the lane, paused beside the open gate. He leaned comfortably against the fence, studying the activity with quiet interest before calling out. "Looks like somebody finally decided to wake the old place up." Ben grinned. "Morning. Thomas." He introduced Margaret to Thomas Reed, a retired mill worker who had lived nearby almost his entire life. Thomas's handshake was firm despite his 71 years, and his eyes wandered toward the abandoned watermill standing beside the stream. "Spent plenty of summers over there when I was a boy," he said. "Didn't work inside much, but I carried sacks, swept floors, and fetched tools for the older men." Margaret invited him to sit on the shaded porch while Ben continued working. Thomas accepted gladly. Looking across the overgrown yard toward the silent mill, he smiled at memories that seemed as old as the weathered stones themselves. "Hard to believe how busy this place used to be," he said. "Before trucks handled everything, farmers lined up from sunrise during harvest season. The water wheel never seemed to stop turning." Margaret listened attentively. She had already begun wondering about the history of the cottage after noticing the carved wheat symbols on the ceiling beams. "Do you remember seeing those carvings?" she asked. Thomas nodded slowly. "Oh, the bundled wheat marks, of course. They were always here. Folks said they stood for good harvests, though nobody ever explained much beyond that. My grandfather used to touch one every time he entered the mill." "Did he ever say why?" Margaret asked. Thomas smiled. "Not really. He'd just pat the beam and say, 'Respect the hands that fed the valley.'" He chuckled softly. "Never understood what he meant when I was young." The conversation drifted naturally from old harvest festivals to village families who had long since moved away. Thomas pointed toward a narrow stone path, almost hidden beneath weeds, leading from the cottage to the mill. "That used to be swept clean every morning," he recalled. "You could hardly see grass between the stones." Margaret looked thoughtfully toward the forgotten walkway, imagining workers crossing it each day carrying grain, tools, and ledgers she assumed had disappeared long ago after Thomas headed home. Ben resumed repairing the pantry floor. While removing several warped boards, he paused and tapped one section with the handle of his hammer. The sound echoed differently than the surrounding wood. He tapped again, then frowned slightly. "Hear that?" Margaret stepped closer. The hollow tone was unmistakable. Every nearby board sounded solid except for one rectangular section near the back wall. Ben knelt carefully and brushed away decades of packed dust gathered between the floorboards. "Could just be an old storage space," he said. "Lots of cottages had root cellars." Margaret remembered that the house records mentioned no cellar beneath the pantry. Curious, she fetched a small pry bar from Ben's toolbox. Working slowly to avoid damaging the aged wood, they loosened several worn boards, one at a time. Beneath them lay a layer of compacted dirt mixed with bits of broken stone and wood fragments. Ben reached down, clearing away more debris with his gloved hands. Suddenly, his fingers struck metal. "There's something here," Margaret crouched beside him as he carefully uncovered the edge of a thick iron ring almost completely hidden beneath the soil. Time had coated it with rust, but its circular shape remained clear. It was firmly attached to a heavy wooden panel concealed below the floor. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The discovery felt too deliberate to dismiss as ordinary construction. Margaret brushed away the remaining dirt around the iron ring until its outline became fully visible. The wooden panel fit tightly within a stone frame, its edges crafted with remarkable precision despite its age. "Looks like nobody's opened this in a very long time," Ben observed quietly. Margaret rested one hand lightly on the cold iron ring, wondering how many years had passed since someone else had touched it. Thomas's stories about the mill, the carved wheat symbols, and now this hidden panel beneath the pantry all seemed connected somehow, though she could not yet explain why. Ben adjusted his footing and wrapped both hands around the rusted ring. "Ready?" he asked. Margaret nodded. Together they pulled upward. At first nothing happened. Then the old wood groaned softly beneath the weight of years. Dust drifted upward as the concealed stone hatch shifted ever so slightly before beginning to lift open. Margaret and Ben held the iron ring together as the concealed hatch resisted years of silence. The old hinges groaned softly before giving way another inch. A cool breath of air drifted upward from below, carrying the faint scent of dry stone and aged wood rather than dampness or decay. Ben paused and looked at Margaret. "That's a good sign," he said quietly. "If this place stayed dry, whatever's down there might still be in decent shape." They lifted the heavy wooden hatch completely and rested it carefully against the pantry wall. Beneath it, a narrow stone staircase disappeared into darkness. Each step had been neatly cut and fitted by skilled hands long ago. Dust coated the edges, but there were no signs of collapsed masonry or standing water. Margaret fetched 2 flashlights from her supplies while Ben tested the first step with his weight. It remained solid. "We'll go slowly," he said. "No rushing." Margaret nodded. Her heart beat faster with curiosity than fear. She had expected to find nothing more than an old storage cellar. Yet the carefully hidden entrance suggested someone had wanted this place forgotten. They descended one careful step at a time. The beam from Margaret's flashlight swept across thick stone walls, whose mortar remained remarkably intact. At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a surprisingly spacious storage room. The ceiling was supported by heavy oak beams darkened with age, but still sturdy. Shelves lined 2 walls, although most of the baskets, cloth sacks, and wooden containers resting upon them had long since deteriorated into little more than brittle fragments. A few broken tools lay scattered near one corner, their handles reduced to splinters. Everything suggested the room had once served an important purpose before being deliberately abandoned. Ben slowly circled the room, examining the foundation. "No flooding," he observed with quiet amazement. "Whoever built this understood drainage. That's probably why the place survived." Margaret ran her hand lightly across one of the stone shelves. A thin layer of dust coated her fingertips, but the surface beneath remained dry and firm. She imagined people descending these same stairs many decades earlier, carrying supplies that no longer remained. The silence surrounding the room felt peaceful rather than unsettling, as though it had simply been waiting. Along the far wall stood a large oak cabinet unlike anything else in the cellar. It was taller than Margaret and reinforced with iron straps that had weathered only slightly despite the passing years. The wood had darkened beautifully with age, and unlike the surrounding shelves, the cabinet appeared almost untouched. Its double doors remained tightly closed beneath a simple iron latch. Ben brushed away the dust covering its front. "This was built separately," he said. "Much better craftsmanship than ordinary storage furniture." Margaret noticed something else immediately. Carved near the top of both cabinet doors was the same bundled wheat symbol she had already found on the cottage beams. The emblem appeared deeper and more carefully finished here, almost ceremonial in its precision. "It's the same mark," she whispered. Ben nodded. "Looks intentional." Together they released the iron latch. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then Ben slowly pulled open the cabinet doors. The hinges turned smoothly, almost as though someone had oiled them shortly before sealing the room, despite the decades that had passed. Inside, neatly arranged wooden shelves filled the cabinet from top to bottom. Instead of valuables or family heirlooms, they found rows of carefully bound ledgers standing upright with remarkable order. Their leather covers had faded with time but remained surprisingly well preserved. Small handwritten labels had been attached to each spine with meticulous care. Margaret stepped closer and read the first one aloud. "Community Records." Another volume beside it carried the same title, followed by a different year. Shelf after shelf held similar books arranged chronologically. There were dozens of them. Below the ledgers rested several wrapped bundles tied with faded linen ribbon. Nearby sat rolled maps protected inside wooden tubes. Everything had been placed with such deliberate organization that the cabinet resembled a carefully maintained archive rather than forgotten storage. Margaret reached for the nearest ledger but hesitated before touching it. "Should we wear gloves?" she asked. Ben smiled approvingly. "Probably a good idea." She climbed back upstairs, found a package of clean cotton gloves among her painting supplies, and returned a few minutes later. The simple precaution somehow made the moment feel even more significant. She slipped on the gloves and gently lifted the first volume from its shelf. Though old, the leather binding remained firm. She carried it to a small wooden work table standing nearby, where a thin coating of dust suggested it too had waited untouched for generations. Carefully she opened the ledger. The pages had yellowed slightly, but remained crisp and remarkably intact. Beautiful handwriting filled every line in dark brown ink that had scarcely faded. Dates, family names, measurements, and careful notes stretched across each page with impressive consistency. Margaret expected lists of grain sales or milling accounts. Instead, the first heading stopped her completely. Community Grain Distribution. Beneath it appeared the names of local families followed by quantities of flour, wheat, oats, and corn issued on specific dates. Beside many entries, another note had been added. Payment deferred, no charge, return after harvest if able. Margaret slowly turned another page. More families, more grain, similar notes. Some entries included brief remarks. House damaged by storm, husband injured, children ill, widow through winter. Ben leaned closer without speaking. Margaret continued reading until she reached the final page of that section. There, in larger handwriting, someone had written a simple sentence: "No family shall leave hungry while grain remains in this mill." She looked up in disbelief. "These aren't business accounts." Ben quietly shook his head. "No." Margaret turned to the beginning of the next section. Across the top of the page, another heading appeared: Spring Famine Relief. Her eyes widened as she read the first several names. Many belonged to families whose memorial plaques she had noticed while driving through the nearby village cemetery. According to every local history booklet she had ever seen, the difficult years had been survived through generous financial assistance provided by several wealthy landowners. Yet this ledger described something entirely different. Day after day, week after week, the mill itself had quietly supplied grain directly to ordinary households throughout the valley. The records listed quantities with astonishing precision, documenting hundreds of distributions that extended across months of hardship. There was no mention of publicity, recognition, or repayment beyond whatever struggling families could someday afford. Margaret carefully closed the ledger for a moment, overwhelmed by the quiet humanity preserved within its pages. She had spent weeks grieving money stolen through greed. Now, beneath an abandoned cottage purchased with the last of her savings, she was holding evidence that generations before her had faced hardship with generosity instead of selfishness. Ben rested one hand gently against the oak cabinet. "Looks like someone wanted these protected." Margaret nodded slowly. She reopened the ledger and looked once more at the neat columns of names before whispering almost to herself, "Why was none of this ever mentioned?" The silent seller offered no answer. Only the carefully preserved community records waited patiently on their shelves, while the first ledger revealed that during one of the valley's hardest seasons, countless struggling families had received grain through this humble mill. A remarkable chapter of local history that seemed to have disappeared completely from every official account Margaret had ever known. Margaret barely slept that night. The image of the oak cabinet filled with carefully preserved ledgers remained fixed in her mind long after she climbed out of the hidden cellar and secured the heavy hatch beneath the pantry floor. Before closing it, she and Ben had agreed not to remove anything until the records could be handled properly. Neither wanted excitement to become carelessness. By sunrise, Margaret had already cleared the dining table, covered it with clean cotton sheets, and gathered notebooks, pencils, acid-free folders she had once purchased for preserving old family photographs, and fresh pairs of gloves. She knew enough to understand that whatever rested beneath the cottage deserved patience before beginning. She telephoned Emily. "I think I found something you need to see," she said simply. Emily immediately recognized the seriousness in her aunt's voice. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," Margaret replied after a brief pause. "Better than all right. I just don't know exactly what it is yet." Emily arrived before noon, carrying archival gloves, a camera, measuring tools, and several storage boxes designed for historical documents. She embraced Margaret tightly before listening to the entire story from the purchase of the cottage to the hidden hatch beneath the pantry. Margaret then led her carefully down the narrow stone staircase into the concealed cellar. Emily stopped halfway across the room. Her eyes settled on the oak cabinet standing against the far wall. "This has been protected intentionally," she whispered. "Someone wanted these records to survive." Margaret nodded. "That's how it feels." Together they opened the cabinet once again. Emily examined the shelves without disturbing their arrangement. "We'll document everything before moving it," she said. "Even the order matters." Ben joined them after finishing a small repair outside and helped carry a folding table into the cellar so the documents never needed to leave the stable environment unless necessary. Throughout the afternoon, the three worked slowly and methodically. Emily assigned each shelf a reference number before photographing it from several angles. Margaret carefully recorded every ledger title exactly as written. Ben measured the cabinet itself, noting its unusual construction and remarkably tight seals. As they continued cataloging, the collection proved even larger than Margaret had first realized. Beyond the community grain records rested neatly bundled mill journals, daily operating books, grain delivery logs, hand-drawn property maps, inventory records, weather observations, correspondence, and several carefully wrapped stacks of black and white photographs. Nothing appeared random. Everything had been organized with remarkable discipline. Emily smiled in quiet amazement. Whoever maintained this archive understood record-keeping extremely well. Margaret gently opened one of the mill journals. Unlike the grain ledgers, these pages described ordinary daily operations: repairs to machinery, river conditions, millstone maintenance, deliveries delayed by heavy rain, workers arriving before sunrise. It painted a picture of steady, practical life rather than dramatic history. Another volume recorded grain deliveries from neighboring farms with careful signatures and dates. Ben examined the photographs while wearing clean gloves. Most showed ordinary people standing beside wagons, flour sacks, horses, or the watermill itself. None of the individuals were identified on the front, but many photographs carried handwritten notes on the reverse listing names and dates. Margaret found herself lingering over their faces. They looked like the people she had known throughout her own life, hard-working, modest, and entirely unaware that someone generations later would quietly study their expressions beneath an old cottage. Late that afternoon, footsteps sounded outside the cottage. Thomas Reed had returned carrying a basket of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. Margaret welcomed him inside and carefully explained the discovery without revealing more than necessary until he could see it himself. Thomas descended the stone staircase slowly, holding the railing as though entering a familiar dream. When he reached the bottom, he removed his cap instinctively. His eyes rested upon the cabinet before drifting across the shelves of ledgers and journals. "I never knew this was here," he said softly. Margaret handed him several photographs. Thomas studied them one by one until he suddenly stopped. "I know this man." He pointed carefully toward a younger worker standing beside stacked grain sacks. "That's Samuel Cooper. My grandfather talked about him often. He worked at the mill before I was born." Emily immediately noted the identification. A few minutes later, Thomas recognized another face, then another. None were famous local figures. They were ordinary mill workers whose names had almost disappeared from living memory. "Funny," Thomas murmured. "I grew up hearing these names around kitchen tables, but you won't find many of them in the town history book." Emily looked up from her notes. "Neither will you find these grain distributions." Margaret opened the local history booklet she had purchased years earlier while visiting the area. It devoted several pages to the difficult harvest seasons experienced by the valley. According to its account, prosperous landowners had organized relief efforts that prevented widespread hunger. Margaret laid the booklet beside the community grain ledger. The difference was impossible to ignore. The hidden records documented daily grain distributions handled directly through the mill over extended periods, listing hundreds of families, precise quantities, and careful notes regarding hardship. Yet the published history barely mentioned the mill at all. Emily frowned thoughtfully. "These accounts don't match." "Not even close," Margaret agreed. Thomas slowly shook his head. "Grandfather always said the mill fed more people than anyone remembered." No one spoke for several moments. The contradiction raised difficult questions, but none of them rushed toward conclusions. Emily reminded them that careful research mattered more than quick assumptions. "The records deserve patience," she said. Margaret appreciated those words. She understood too well how easily people could reach conclusions before gathering every fact. As evening approached, they continued cataloging one shelf at a time. Wrapped beneath several folded maps, Margaret noticed a small envelope tucked carefully against the cabinet wall. It was thinner than the ledgers and sealed with fading wax that had long since cracked naturally with age. Written neatly across its front were only a few words. She opened it carefully. Inside rested a single handwritten note folded twice. The paper had yellowed, but remained remarkably clear. Margaret unfolded it slowly while Emily and Thomas leaned closer. The message contained only one sentence, written in firm, deliberate handwriting. "Hide these records until kindness is remembered again." Silence settled over the cellar. The words seemed almost too simple after everything they had discovered, yet they carried unexpected weight. Margaret read the sentence again, this time more quietly. Whoever had hidden the archive had not written about wealth, ownership, or recognition. The message spoke only of kindness. Emily carefully placed the note inside a protective archival sleeve before looking back toward the long rows of ledgers, journals, photographs, maps, and grain records that had waited silently beneath the cottage for generations, all preserved by someone who believed their greatest value would not be understood until the day people were ready to remember the quiet goodness that had once sustained an entire community. Margaret settled into a steady rhythm over the following days. Each morning began with practical chores around the cottage before she joined Emily in the hidden cellar to continue cataloging the remarkable collection. Ben completed repairs one section at a time, reinforcing aging floor joists, replacing damaged window frames, and repairing loose stonework without disturbing the concealed archive beneath the pantry. Thomas stopped by almost every afternoon, bringing memories instead of tools. His stories rarely sounded dramatic, yet they added life to the names filling the ledgers. Slowly, the abandoned Miller's cottage no longer felt like a forgotten ruin. It felt like a place patiently waiting to tell its story. Emily suggested that before attempting to interpret the larger archive, they should carefully read the mill journals in chronological order. Margaret agreed. They selected the earliest surviving volume and placed it gently upon the work table inside the cellar. Unlike the community grain records, which documented names and quantities with remarkable precision, the daily journals captured the quieter rhythm of ordinary life. One entry described volunteers remaining after sunset to repair damaged millstones before an approaching harvest. Another noted neighbors arriving together after heavy flooding to clear fallen trees from the stream without requesting payment. There were pages devoted to repairing wagons, sharpening tools, maintaining water channels, and storing flour before winter storms arrived. Margaret noticed something unusual as they continued reading. Whenever difficult seasons appeared, the journal rarely emphasized shortages alone. Instead, nearly every hardship was followed by descriptions of cooperation. Families shared horses when one became injured. Farmers combined harvest crews after illness struck neighboring households. Bakers accepted delayed payments during poor harvests. The mill itself often remained open long after normal hours whenever storms delayed deliveries. This wasn't just a business, Margaret observed quietly. Emily nodded while copying several references into her notebook. It functioned like the center of the community. Thomas smiled gently. That's how my grandfather always described it. Folks came for flour, but they also came because everyone eventually needed somebody's help. They opened another journal covering one of the valley's harshest growing seasons. Margaret expected repeated accounts of financial losses. Instead, the entries carefully documented additional grain distributions, volunteer deliveries to isolated farms, anonymous donations left overnight inside the mill, and repeated reminders that no struggling family should be turned away. The records never praised individual generosity. They simply treated helping one another as ordinary responsibility. Margaret leaned back thoughtfully. These people didn't seem interested in receiving credit. Emily looked up from the page she was photographing. Maybe that's why the note said kindness instead of recognition. The words lingered in Margaret's thoughts long after they closed the journal. She had spent weeks grieving the money stolen through deception. Yet every page she now read described people measuring wealth differently. Their greatest concern had not been preserving profits, but preserving one another. The realization did not erase her own loss, but it quietly changed the way she carried it. Later that week, while Ben repaired loose stones along the front pathway, a pickup truck pulled into the cottage yard. The driver introduced himself as David Harper, owner of neighboring farmland. He apologized for arriving without notice, but explained that he had wanted to welcome Margaret since purchasing the property. David spoke with calm practicality rather than curiosity. He complimented the progress already visible around the cottage and admired Ben's restoration work. Standing beside the weathered stone wall overlooking the old watermill, He glanced across the property before speaking again. "You've taken on quite a project," he said with an easy smile. "Most people would have walked away after seeing the condition." Margaret laughed softly. "Some days I wonder if I should have." "Well," David replied kindly, "it's looking better every week. If you ever decide the work becomes too much, let me know. I'd certainly be interested in buying the property someday. Nothing urgent. Just keep me in mind." There was no pressure in his voice, only genuine respect. Margaret appreciated the straightforward offer. "Thank you," she answered. "Right now, I think I'd like to see where this journey leads." David nodded. "Fair enough. I hope you do." Before leaving, he wished her well and drove back toward his farm. Ben watched the truck disappear down the lane. "Good man," he remarked. "Practical. Says what he means." Margaret agreed. The conversation left her unexpectedly thoughtful. Only weeks earlier, she might have accepted the first reasonable opportunity to recover financially. Now, each day spent uncovering the cottage's history made selling feel less imaginable. She could not yet explain why. That afternoon, Emily continued organizing one section of the oak cabinet that they had not fully examined. Several wrapped bundles rested behind the mill journals, protected beneath layers of carefully folded linen. Most contained additional correspondence tied neatly with faded ribbon. Emily removed them one at a time, recording their positions before placing them into archival boxes. Near the very back of the lowest shelf, almost hidden behind a stack of property maps, her fingertips touched something thicker than the surrounding bundles. "Margaret?" she called quietly. "There's another book back here." Together they carefully slid it forward. Unlike the other ledgers, this volume was bound in dark leather, reinforced with heavier stitching along the spine. Although dust covered its surface, the binding remained remarkably well preserved. There was no decorative carving beyond the familiar bundled wheat symbol pressed into the center of the cover. Beneath it, written in careful gold lettering, now softened by age, appeared 4 simple words: Master Grain Register. Emily looked toward Margaret without saying anything. Thomas slowly removed his cap once more, instinctively recognizing that this volume held special importance. Even Ben stepped closer from the cellar doorway, after noticing the change in everyone's expression. Margaret gently rested both gloved hands upon the closed cover. Throughout the cabinet, they had discovered journals, photographs, maps, grain records, delivery logs, and the handwritten message asking that kindness be remembered again. Every collection had revealed another piece of the mill's quiet history. Yet this newly discovered volume seemed different. Its title suggested not another ordinary ledger, but something meant to bring the entire archive together. Margaret drew a slow breath as the 4 of them gathered silently around the old work table. Then, with careful hands and growing anticipation, she lifted the front cover of the Master Grain Register, stopping the moment the first page began to reveal itself. Margaret opened the Master Grain Register with the same care she might have given a fragile family Bible. The heavy leather cover settled quietly against the work table, revealing a title page written in elegant handwriting that matched the journals and community grain records. Unlike the other ledgers, however, this volume began with a short explanation rather than lists of names or daily entries. Emily adjusted the camera to photograph each page before anyone touched it. Margaret read aloud while Thomas, Ben, and Emily listened in silence. This register has been prepared so that every grain distribution, every journal entry, every delivery record, and every account may be traced together should future generations seek the complete history of the mill. Margaret looked up. "It's an index." Emily smiled with growing excitement. "More than an index. It's a guide to the entire collection." Each section carefully cross-referenced the archive. Beside every grain distribution appeared the matching journal page describing weather conditions, harvest yields, wagon deliveries, volunteer workers, and inventory changes. The person who created the register had anticipated that someday someone might question whether the records belonged together. Every page quietly answered those doubts before they could even be asked. Ben turned several pages carefully. Whoever organized this wanted every fact to support another fact. Emily nodded. This is remarkable record-keeping. They continued reading through the afternoon. One chapter summarized years of difficult harvests without exaggeration or drama. Poor weather, damaged crops, livestock disease, and harsh winters had repeatedly reduced food supplies across the valley. Yet beside every difficult season, the register directed readers toward corresponding community grain records, showing how the mill responded. Margaret compared the references one by one. Each matched perfectly. Grain quantities listed in the distribution ledgers corresponded exactly with reductions recorded in inventory books. Wagon deliveries noted in daily journals aligned with the dates families received flour and grain. Weather observations explained why certain harvests had failed. Nothing contradicted anything else. Instead, every document quietly strengthened the next. Emily looked up from her notebook. This collection verifies itself. Margaret slowly nodded. No wonder someone worked so hard to preserve it. As they progressed, another pattern emerged. The official history booklet Margaret had purchased continued to describe relief efforts led primarily by prosperous landowners whose financial contributions had supposedly carried the valley through repeated hardships. Yet nowhere inside the master grain register did those accounts appear as the central story. Wealthy residents were occasionally mentioned when they donated grain or equipment, but they appeared alongside dozens of ordinary farmers, bakers, laborers, widows, school teachers, blacksmiths, mill workers, and neighbors who each contributed whatever they could. The register described a community effort rather than the work of a small number of prominent individuals. Margaret rested her hand gently upon the open page. It's as though everyone carried part of the burden. Thomas smiled thoughtfully. That's closer to what my grandfather used to say. Nobody waited for someone important to solve every problem. Folks simply helped because they knew next season it might be their turn to need help. Emily carefully marked another reference connecting a grain ledger with its supporting journal. The published history isn't exactly false, she said, but it's incomplete. These records show something much larger. Margaret agreed. She thought again about the handwritten message hidden inside the cabinet. Hide these records until kindness is remembered again. The words suddenly seemed even more meaningful. Whoever concealed the archive had not been protecting accusations or scandals. They had been protecting the memory of ordinary generosity that had gradually faded from public memory. During the following week, Margaret and Emily developed a careful catalog system. Every ledger received an identifying number while preserving its original arrangement inside the cabinet. Photographs were matched with names whenever Thomas recognized familiar faces or family connections. Property maps were unfolded only long enough to photograph and measure before being safely rolled again. Ben built simple wooden supports, allowing fragile volumes to remain open during documentation without straining their bindings. The hidden cellar slowly transformed into an organized workspace where every discovery added another piece to the larger picture. Margaret often found herself smiling during ordinary moments. She noticed it one morning while sweeping the cottage kitchen before beginning another day's work. Weeks earlier, she had struggled simply to imagine a future after losing her pension. Now each sunrise offered another opportunity to preserve something valuable. She still missed the security her retirement savings should have provided. Bills still required careful planning. Nothing about her financial situation had magically improved. Yet the heaviness she had carried since the fraud no longer defined every waking thought. Instead of dwelling on what had been stolen, she increasingly focused on what had unexpectedly been placed into her care. One afternoon, she spread several copied family names across the dining table. "Emily," she said thoughtfully. "I wonder how many of these families still live nearby." Emily glanced over the pages. Some surnames remained familiar from local mailboxes and cemetery markers. Others had likely disappeared generations earlier. "We could start making a list," she suggested. "Not conclusions, just descendants we might eventually contact." Margaret agreed. They began writing carefully organized notes, identifying families whose names appeared repeatedly throughout the community grain records. Thomas occasionally recognized one surname and offered a memory passed down through his grandparents. Other names required comparing old property maps with modern county records. The work progressed slowly, but Margaret enjoyed every careful step. Each name represented real people who had once accepted or offered help through the old mill. As the list gradually expanded, the archive felt less like ancient history and more like a bridge connecting past and present. Late one afternoon, David Harper returned while Ben was replacing loose stones along the stream bank. He admired the visible improvements around the cottage before walking with Margaret toward the old watermill. "You've certainly brought life back to this place," he said. Margaret smiled. "We're trying." David glanced across the quiet property. "I attended a township planning meeting yesterday. Nothing immediate, but people have started talking about ways to encourage heritage tourism in this part of the valley. If this old mill keeps improving, there may eventually be interest in recognizing the site somehow." Margaret appreciated the information. "Thank you for letting me know." "Just thought you'd want to hear it," David replied. "Historic places sometimes attract attention once people notice them again." His tone remained practical, neither encouraging nor discouraging. After wishing everyone well, he drove away toward his farm. Margaret watched his truck disappear before returning inside the cottage. That evening, after Ben finished for the day and Emily packed away her notes, Thomas lingered on the front porch overlooking the silent water wheel. The setting sun painted the old timbers with soft amber light. For several minutes, none of them spoke. Finally, Thomas smiled to himself. "You know," he said quietly, "my grandfather had a saying he'd repeat every autumn." Margaret turned toward him. "What was it?" Thomas looked across the stream toward the abandoned mill, his expression filled with distant memory. Whenever harvest ended and someone asked whether the old mill still held any value, he'd simply say, "The real harvest sleeps beneath the old mill." Silence followed his words. Margaret felt a quiet shiver despite the warm evening air. She thought of the hidden cellar, the carefully organized ledgers, the journals, the photographs, the maps, the community grain records, and the master grain register that had patiently connected them all. Looking once more toward the weathered mill standing peacefully beside the flowing water, she realized Thomas's grandfather had unknowingly carried the truth for decades without ever revealing what those simple words truly meant. Margaret's handwritten list of family names continued growing across the dining table until it filled several pages. Emily had carefully organized every surname found within the community grain records, matching them with dates, journal references, and the supporting entries from the master grain register. Whenever Thomas recognized a family name from stories told by his grandparents, another small note appeared beside it. The work demanded patience rather than speed. Some names had disappeared entirely from the valley, while others remained surprisingly common among nearby farms and village homes. Margaret suggested they begin with only a few families whose connections seemed easiest to verify. Emily agreed. "We're not trying to prove anything to people," she reminded everyone. "We're simply asking whether they might have old photographs, letters, or family records that could help us understand the archive." Their first visit took them only a few miles away to a modest farmhouse owned by Daniel Cooper, whose surname appeared repeatedly throughout the grain ledgers. Daniel welcomed the visitors politely after Emily explained why they had come. At first, he seemed uncertain that his family could possibly be connected to the abandoned mill. When Margaret carefully showed him a photographed page from the community grain records listing the name Samuel Cooper, Daniel stared at it for several long moments before quietly excusing himself. He returned carrying an old wooden box that had belonged to his grandmother. Inside rested faded photographs, several carefully folded letters, and a small family Bible. Together they examined the photographs one by one until Daniel suddenly stopped. "This is him," he whispered, pointing toward a young man standing beside stacked grain sacks in front of the watermill. Thomas smiled immediately. "That's the same photograph from the archive." Daniel's voice softened. "Grandmother always said Samuel worked harder than anyone she ever knew. We never had many details." Margaret explained that Thomas had already recognized Samuel in the hidden collection beneath the cottage. Daniel sat quietly for a long time before speaking again. "I never imagined there might still be records of his work." Before they left, Daniel carefully allowed Emily to photograph several family letters mentioning difficult harvest seasons and the mill. None directly described the hidden grain distributions, yet the dates matched perfectly with the archive. Their next visit led them to the home of an elderly retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Briggs. Her grandfather's name appeared dozens of times throughout the ledgers, sometimes receiving grain during poor seasons, and other years contributing supplies after successful harvests. Eleanor welcomed the visitors warmly and listened with growing emotion as Margaret described the records. "Grandfather always insisted neighbors kept one another alive," she said. "People smiled politely whenever he said it, but no one seemed to believe those old stories anymore." She disappeared briefly before returning with a carefully preserved recipe book passed through several generations. Tucked inside rested handwritten notes describing bread being baked for neighboring families during years of poor harvests. Emily photographed every page, while Eleanor watched quietly. "I always thought these were just family memories," she said. Margaret gently replied, "Sometimes family memories become history." Over the following weeks, similar visits continued. Not every conversation produced remarkable discoveries, yet almost every family offered something meaningful. One household shared a diary describing volunteers delivering flour after severe flooding. Another produced an old photograph showing wagons gathered outside the mill during autumn harvest. A retired mechanic uncovered letters mentioning community grain collections after livestock disease affected neighboring farms. Individually, the items seemed ordinary. Together, they quietly strengthened the picture emerging from the archive. Emily carefully separated every newly documented family item from the original collection, while recording exactly where each piece had originated. Margaret admired her discipline. "You're making sure no one ever wonders what belonged to the archive and what came later." Emily smiled. "That's how future historians will trust all of it." Thomas accompanied them whenever his health allowed. Sometimes he contributed little more than a remembered surname or an old family nickname. But those small details often unlocked connections no document alone could provide. Watching descendants discover forgotten pieces of their own family history became one of Margaret's favorite parts of each week. More than once, she saw elderly visitors wipe away tears after recognizing a grandparent's name inside the community grain records. Nobody celebrated wealth or status. Instead, people quietly expressed gratitude that ordinary acts of kindness had not disappeared completely. Meanwhile, Ben continued restoring the cottage with the same steady dedication he had shown from the beginning. He repaired damaged shutters, strengthened sections of the porch, rebuilt part of the old garden wall, and carefully reinforced structural beams without disturbing the original craftsmanship. Margaret repeatedly insisted on paying him for additional hours beyond their original agreement. Each time, Ben politely declined. "The original estimate still covers it," he said. Margaret frowned gently. "You've done far more than we agreed." Ben simply smiled. "Maybe, but this place deserves to stand another 100 years." She understood he meant every word. His generosity reminded her of the journal entries describing neighbors quietly helping one another without expecting recognition. One evening, after finishing repairs along the stream bank, Ben and Margaret remained seated on the cottage porch while the last sunlight reflected across the motionless water wheel. Thomas had already gone home, and Emily was inside organizing another day's photographs. For a while, neither spoke. The peaceful silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Ben looked toward the old mill. "Funny how things work out," he said. "When you first called me, I figured I'd spend a few days fixing loose boards." Margaret laughed softly. "I thought exactly the same." He glanced toward her with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever wish you'd never found the archive?" She considered the question carefully. "No," she answered after a long pause. "I wish I'd never lost my pension. I still miss the security it represented. But if that hadn't happened, I never would have come here." Ben nodded quietly. "Life doesn't always replace what it takes away." Margaret looked toward the weather cottage she had bought with her last $250. "No," she agreed, "but sometimes it gives you something you never knew to look for." The conversation stayed with her long after Ben drove home. She realized the grief she carried over the fraud had gradually changed shape. It no longer controlled every decision or every memory. The loss remained real, but purpose had slowly grown beside it. Caring for the archive, welcoming descendants, preserving forgotten kindness, and watching strangers reconnect with their own history filled a part of her life that money alone never could have touched. The following afternoon, Emily continued examining one remaining compartment inside the oak cabinet that had received only a brief inspection earlier. Behind several bound inventory books, she noticed a slim volume resting inside a protective wooden sleeve. Like the master grain register, this ledger appeared smaller and more frequently handled before the archive had been hidden. Across its cover, written in the same careful handwriting found throughout the collection, appeared a simple title: Publication Authorization Register. Emily carefully lifted it from its sleeve and opened the first pages. Each entry listed dates, document titles, signatures, and formal approvals connected to the mill's official grain records. She quickly compared several entries with the community grain records and then with the master grain register. Every reference matched exactly. Looking up at Margaret with quiet excitement, she whispered, "This proves the grain records weren't private notes or unofficial lists. They were formally authorized records from the mill itself." Margaret stepped closer as Emily slowly turned another page. Realizing they had just uncovered yet another carefully preserved piece of evidence, confirming that the hidden archive had always been an official record of the community's shared effort to help one another survive. Margaret and Emily spent the next several mornings studying the newly discovered publication authorization register page by page before drawing any conclusions. The careful habit they had developed from the beginning remained unchanged. Every statement inside the hidden archive needed to be supported by another record. Emily photographed each authorization page before comparing it with the corresponding community grain record, the master grain register, the daily mill journals, inventory books, delivery logs, weather observations, and property records. Again and again, the documents reinforced one another with remarkable precision. Each grain distribution approved in the authorization register appeared in the community grain records. Every quantity matched the inventory books. Wagon deliveries corresponded exactly with daily operating journals. Weather reports explained failed harvests, while later entries documented improved conditions and reduced assistance. Margaret watched the growing web of connections spread across Emily's large reference board inside the cottage dining room. Colored note cards linked one document to another until the entire archive resembled a carefully woven map rather than a collection of isolated discoveries. "There isn't a weak connection anywhere," Emily said one afternoon as she reviewed another completed comparison. "Every important record points to supporting evidence." Margaret nodded quietly. The person who preserved this archive wanted future generations to trust it because the truth could be verified. Ben stepped inside after finishing repairs to the rear porch and examined the growing display without interrupting. Though he rarely spoke during Emily's research sessions, he appreciated the discipline behind every conclusion. "Looks like building a house," he remarked with a smile. "Every beam supports another beam." Emily laughed. "That's exactly how it feels." During the following week, they repeated the process until every major ledger had been checked against the authorization register. No significant contradictions appeared. Instead, the evidence became stronger with every comparison. The grain distributions had never been random gifts remembered through family stories alone. They had been carefully documented, officially authorized, properly recorded, and systematically preserved within the hidden cellar. Margaret often paused before the oak cabinet after another successful day of cataloging. She remembered the fear she had felt after discovering her retirement savings had vanished. Back then, every official document she received seemed to describe loss, uncertainty, or legal delays. Now she found herself surrounded by records that represented something entirely different. These pages spoke of responsibility, honesty, and neighbors quietly caring for one another without expecting recognition. The contrast filled her with unexpected gratitude. One Saturday morning, several descendants returned, carrying additional family keepsakes after hearing from Daniel Cooper and Eleanor Briggs about the discoveries beneath the cottage. Margaret welcomed everyone into the restored front room before explaining how carefully every item would be documented. No original family possession would become part of the hidden archive itself. Emily photographed each object separately while recording its owner and family history. One visitor brought a faded delivery receipt bearing the same date listed in the community grain records. Another carried a handwritten household account book recording flour received after severe flooding damaged crops. An elderly couple arrived with a carefully preserved photograph showing volunteers loading grain sacks beside the mill during winter. Thomas immediately recognized two faces standing near the wagon. "That's William Porter," he said with quiet confidence. "And beside him is Jacob Mills. Grandfather worked with both of them." Emily carefully recorded every identification. None of the newly shared materials altered the hidden archive. Instead, each family item quietly confirmed details already preserved inside the cellar. Margaret noticed how meaningful those confirmations became for the visitors themselves. They no longer viewed old letters, recipes, receipts, or photographs as ordinary family keepsakes. They understood they represented living connections to the community described within the grain ledgers. Several families offered to donate copies of everything they possessed for future research while keeping their original heirlooms at home. Margaret thanked each of them sincerely. "These belong to your families," she said. "Sharing copies allows everyone to learn without asking anyone to surrender their history." The visitors appreciated that approach. As the weeks passed, the cottage slowly became a gathering place where conversations about the valley's past unfolded naturally around the kitchen table. No one arrived seeking fame or recognition. They came because someone they loved had quietly become part of a forgotten story that was finally being remembered. David Harper visited one afternoon after hearing from neighbors that descendants had begun gathering regularly at the old mill. Margaret invited him inside and showed him the restoration work completed so far, without revealing fragile original documents unnecessarily. Emily explained how the authorization register connected every major record in the archive, while Ben described the structural improvements protecting the building itself. David listened carefully before looking around the restored cottage. "I understand now why you've stayed," he said to Margaret. She smiled gently. So do I. David nodded thoughtfully. This place deserves preserving exactly as it is. There was no mention of buying the property this time. Instead, he asked practical questions about protecting the old stone walls and improving drainage around the mill. Before leaving, he wished everyone success and added quietly, "If anyone asks my opinion, I'll tell them this history belongs here." His simple statement meant more to Margaret than she expected. Support was arriving not through grand speeches, but through ordinary people recognizing quiet value. Emily soon reached the point where every major document category had been fully cataloged. Grain ledgers, mill journals, delivery books, inventory records, weather logs, photographs, property maps, correspondence, the master grain register. And now, the publication authorization register all supported one another with remarkable consistency. She reviewed the complete catalog one final time before closing her notebook. "We're ready," she said. Margaret looked up from the work table. "Ready for what?" "Professional examination." Thomas smiled from his chair near the cellar stairs. I suppose that day had to come. Margaret felt both excitement and responsibility. She understood the archive deserved careful outside evaluation, yet she also hoped those reviewing it would appreciate the humanity preserved within the records rather than seeing only historical documents. Emily prepared a detailed summary describing the collection, its organization, preservation conditions, and the methods used during cataloging. Every statement referenced supporting documents. Nothing relied on assumption. Several days later, she submitted the summary, along with sample photographs and catalog descriptions, to the State Agricultural Heritage Society, the organization responsible for evaluating historically significant agricultural collections throughout the region. Then they waited. Life around the cottage continued much as before. Ben completed another section of the porch roof. Margaret welcomed occasional visitors and continued organizing the growing catalog. Thomas shared more memories whenever they surfaced. Although everyone hoped for a positive response, none allowed anticipation to replace patience. One quiet afternoon, as Margaret sorted archival folders near the front window, Emily's phone rang. She listened carefully for several moments before smiling with restrained excitement. After thanking the caller, she slowly lowered the phone and looked toward the others gathered inside the cottage. "That was the State Agricultural Heritage Society," she said. The room fell silent. Emily took a steady breath before continuing. "After reviewing our documentation, they want to conduct a full in-person examination of the entire collection." Margaret looked toward the old watermill through the kitchen window, then back toward the hidden pantry floor beneath which the carefully preserved archive had waited in silence for generations. Knowing that the next visitors to descend those stone steps would come not simply as curious guests, but as experts prepared to determine whether the forgotten story of an ordinary community's kindness would finally receive the recognition it had patiently awaited for so many years, the morning the State Agricultural Heritage Society arrived. Margaret unlocked the front door of the miller's cottage with the same quiet routine she had followed since moving into the old stone house. The autumn air carried the familiar scent of damp leaves and the steady sound of water flowing past the silent mill wheel. Nothing about the property appeared grand. Freshly repaired shutters framed the windows. The stone walls had been cleaned without erasing their age. The porch Ben had carefully restored welcomed visitors with simple wooden benches rather than polished displays. Margaret smiled to herself. The cottage looked exactly as it should, honest, well cared for, and respectful of its history. Shortly before 10 o'clock, 2 vehicles turned slowly into the gravel drive. Emily greeted the visitors alongside Margaret, while Ben and Thomas waited nearby. The inspection team consisted of archivists, agricultural historians, and preservation specialists whose calm professionalism immediately reassured Margaret. They explained that their purpose was not to search for sensational discoveries, but to determine the authenticity, organization, condition, and historical importance of the collection. Emily handed each visitor a copy of the catalog she had prepared, carefully documenting every ledger, journal, photograph, map, inventory book, weather record, correspondence file, the master grain register, and the publication authorization register. One of the archivists smiled as she reviewed the pages. "This is exceptionally well organized." Emily thanked her quietly. "We wanted every conclusion supported by the documents themselves." The examination began in the hidden cellar beneath the pantry. Margaret watched silently as the visitors descended the narrow stone staircase one at a time. Their first reactions reminded her of her own. They paused before the oak cabinet, studied its construction, examined the carved wheat emblem, and carefully observed the stable environment that had protected the collection for generations. Rather than opening everything immediately, they documented the cabinet itself, the room, the shelving arrangement, and the original placement of every category before removing a single volume. Margaret appreciated their patience. It reflected the same respect she and her friends had tried to show since the day they first lifted the concealed hatch. Over the following days, the specialists worked methodically. Every community grain record was compared against the master grain register. The publication authorization register was examined alongside inventory books and daily mill journals. Delivery logs matched weather observations exactly as Emily's research had already demonstrated. Handwriting specialists confirmed consistency across the collection, while preservation experts praised the remarkably dry conditions that had allowed paper, leather, and photographs to survive with minimal deterioration. Thomas visited often during the examination, answering questions about local families and identifying workers whose names still survived in community memory. Daniel Cooper and Eleanor Briggs willingly shared copies of the family materials they had previously provided. Other descendants also contributed photographs, letters, and household records already documented by Emily. None of those family collections replaced the hidden archive. Instead, they quietly reinforced it, confirming that the people named inside the ledgers had truly lived the ordinary lives the records described. Margaret rarely interrupted the examination. Most days, she prepared coffee, welcomed visitors, answered practical questions about the discovery, and quietly returned to ordinary chores whenever possible. She often found herself standing outside beside the old water wheel while experts worked below the cottage, looking across the stream. She reflected on how different her mornings had become. Only months earlier, she had measured each day by the money she had lost. Now she found purpose simply by helping preserve something that belonged to everyone. After nearly 3 weeks of careful study, the examination reached its conclusion. The inspection team gathered inside the restored front room where sunlight warmed the old wooden floor. Margaret, Emily, Ben, Thomas, David Harper, Daniel Cooper, Eleanor Briggs, and several descendants quietly filled the chairs arranged around the room. The lead archivist stood beside the dining table where the final report rested. She smiled warmly before speaking. "We have completed our examination of the Miller's Cottage archive." The room became perfectly still. "Our findings confirm that the collection is authentic, internally consistent, exceptionally well preserved, and historically significant. The community grain records supporting journals, inventory books, delivery logs, weather observations, maps, photographs, the master grain register, and the publication authorization register collectively provide a reliable historical record documenting the community grain sharing network centered around the old watermill." Margaret felt tears quietly forming as the archivist continued. "In our professional opinion, this archive represents an important contribution to regional agricultural and community history. No applause followed immediately. Instead, quiet emotion filled the room as descendants looked toward one another with gentle smiles. Thomas slowly removed his cap once again, just as he had the first day he entered the hidden cellar. Daniel Cooper wiped his eyes before looking down at the copy of Samuel Cooper's photograph resting in his lap. Eleanor Briggs held her grandmother's recipe book against her chest without speaking. The recognition belonged not to famous names, but to ordinary families whose kindness had finally found its place within history. News of the authentication spread steadily through the valley over the following weeks. Local newspapers published respectful articles describing the discovery. Historians requested appointments to study the collection. Teachers asked whether future students might someday visit the cottage. Families continued arriving to share memories connected to the names preserved inside the ledgers. Margaret welcomed each visitor with the same quiet gratitude. She never allowed excitement to replace careful stewardship. Every request followed the preservation guidelines Emily had developed. Every document remained protected. Every conversation emphasized evidence rather than exaggeration. One afternoon, David Harper stopped by after attending a township meeting. Standing beside the restored stone wall overlooking the mill, he smiled at Margaret before speaking. "I wanted you to hear it from me." She looked at him curiously. "Hear what?" "I've withdrawn every redevelopment discussion involving the neighboring properties around the mill." Margaret blinked in surprise. David nodded toward the old buildings. "This place deserves preserving exactly as it stands. Whatever opportunities existed before, they don't matter now." Margaret thanked him sincerely. She understood the decision had not been made dramatically. Like everything else surrounding the cottage, it reflected quiet respect rather than grand gestures. As recognition grew, several organizations and private collectors contacted Margaret, expressing interest in purchasing either the archive itself or the entire property. Each offer was generous compared with the $250 she had paid only months earlier. Emily carefully reviewed the proposals with her aunt, but never encouraged any particular decision. Margaret appreciated the confidence others now placed in the collection. Yet each evening when she locked the cottage door and listened to the gentle sound of water passing the silent mill, selling somehow felt impossible. The archive belonged where it had patiently waited through generations. She politely thanked each interested buyer and explained that no decision would be rushed. One quiet evening, after the last visitor had departed, Margaret returned alone to the hidden cellar to ensure every cabinet latch remained secure before closing for the night. The familiar stillness greeted her like an old friend. She carefully checked each shelf, each ledger, and each protective box exactly as she had done countless times before. While sliding one archival storage case back into its place inside the oak cabinet, she noticed something unusual near the rear corner of the lowest shelf. Hidden behind the cabinet support where it could not easily be seen, rested a flat sealed envelope she had somehow overlooked during months of careful cataloging. Dust covered its surface, suggesting it had remained undisturbed since the cabinet had first been closed. Margaret gently lifted it into the light. The paper felt slightly thicker than the small handwritten note they had discovered weeks earlier. Across the front, written in the same familiar hand that appeared throughout the archive, were 5 carefully formed words: "To whoever saved this mill." Margaret remained alone in the hidden cellar for several moments, holding the sealed envelope in both hands. The familiar silence that had once felt mysterious now felt comforting, almost protective. Dust still rested lightly upon the paper, confirming that it had remained untouched since the day the oak cabinet had been closed. She resisted the temptation to open it immediately. Too many meaningful discoveries inside the miller's cottage had become richer because they were shared. She carefully carried the envelope upstairs, locked the cellar, and telephoned Emily. Ben and Thomas arrived not long afterward, and even though evening shadows had already begun stretching across the old watermill, none of them suggested waiting until morning. They gathered around the same dining table where so many journals, grain ledgers, photographs, maps, and records had first been studied. The envelope rested quietly in the center. Across its front, the familiar handwriting remained clear. To whoever saved this mill. Margaret carefully loosened the old seal without damaging the paper. Inside rested a single folded letter. The handwriting matched the notes they had already discovered inside the archive. She unfolded the page slowly and began reading aloud. If these words have reached you, then this mill has survived because someone believed that memory is worth protecting even when no reward follows. We did not hide these records to preserve grain. Grain feeds a family for a season. We hid these records to preserve the memory of neighbors whose kindness deserved to feed generations. We feared that one day people would remember only those with wealth, while forgetting those who quietly carried flour across muddy roads, shared harvests with strangers, repaired wagons without payment, baked bread for hungry children, and opened their barns when another family had nothing left. Margaret paused, her voice unsteady, before continuing. The ledgers were never meant to celebrate one person. They belong to everyone whose name appears within them, and also to those whose names were never written because they believed kindness required no audience. If history remembers only success, it becomes incomplete. If history remembers compassion, it becomes honest. Should this mill ever be opened again, let those who care for it restore these ordinary lives gently. Let no bitterness guide them. Do not reopen old arguments. Do not search for blame. Allow the records to speak quietly for themselves, because truth carried with humility endures longer than truth carried with anger. Thomas slowly lowered his head. Emily carefully wiped away tears before Margaret continued reading the final lines. If you have chosen preservation instead of profit, then you already understand the greatest lesson this mill can offer. A community survives not because a few possess abundance, but because many choose generosity. Should this building still stand, let it remain a place where children, families, and strangers alike may learn that the strongest foundations are built not from stone alone, but from ordinary people who quietly refuse to let one another face hardship alone. The letter ended without a signature. There was no dramatic confession, no hidden fortune, no final mystery waiting to be solved. Only gratitude, humility, and a simple hope that the memory of everyday kindness would survive. Margaret folded the letter carefully before placing it beside the earlier handwritten note that had instructed future generations to remember kindness. Together, the two messages completed the purpose of the entire archive. The records had never been hidden to expose wrongdoing or elevate forgotten heroes above others. They had been preserved so the quiet goodness of ordinary neighbors would never disappear completely during the months that followed. The future of the miller's cottage and the old watermill slowly became clear. Working alongside the State Agricultural Heritage Society, local officials, descendants, and community volunteers, plans were developed to preserve both buildings exactly where history had left them. Restoration focused on protecting original materials rather than replacing them. Ben supervised structural work with the same careful craftsmanship he had shown from the beginning, strengthening beams, repairing stonework, and ensuring that future visitors could safely experience the buildings without sacrificing their authenticity. The hidden cellar remained intact beneath the pantry. Climate-controlled storage protected the original community grain records. Mill journals, photographs, mats, correspondence, the master grain register, the publication authorization register, and every supporting document. Visitors would eventually descend the same narrow stone staircase Margaret had discovered beneath the concealed hatch, seeing the archive where it had patiently rested through generations. Emily continued expanding the catalog with unwavering care. Every descendant who contributed copies of family photographs, letters, diaries, recipes, or receipts found their materials carefully documented as companion collections, while the original archive remained clearly distinguished. Students from nearby universities began visiting to study historical preservation, archival methods, and community history. Teachers organized educational visits so children could learn not simply how a watermill operated, but how ordinary people once cared for one another during difficult years. Thomas became the cottage's favorite storyteller. Sitting beside the restored water wheel or inside the old mill, he shared memories passed down from his grandfather, explaining how neighbors once viewed helping one another as part of everyday life, rather than extraordinary charity. Visitors listened with quiet attention when he repeated the words that had guided them all along. The real harvest sleeps beneath the old mill. Now everyone understood what those words truly meant. Daniel Cooper often stood before the photograph of Samuel Cooper, proudly telling younger family members about an ancestor whose work had quietly returned to history. Eleanor Briggs smiled whenever children read the old bread recipes preserved by her grandmother. Other descendants discovered relatives listed throughout the grain ledgers, finding comfort in knowing that their families had not been forgotten after all. David Harper became one of the strongest supporters of preserving the surrounding landscape. He worked with local officials to ensure that future development respected the character of the historic site. One afternoon, standing beside the restored stone wall overlooking the stream, he smiled at Margaret. "I'm glad you never accepted my offer to sell." Margaret laughed softly. "So am I." Before long, the miller's cottage and adjoining watermill officially opened as a community heritage museum and local history research center. The opening ceremony remained simple. There were no elaborate speeches celebrating individuals. Instead, descendants of the families named within the community grain records stood together beneath the old oak trees while children carried small bundles of wheat tied with ribbon. Honoring the symbol carved throughout the cottage and cabinet, Margaret accepted the position of permanent curator with quiet gratitude. Her responsibilities suited her naturally. Each morning, she unlocked the front door, welcomed visitors, answered questions, protected the archive, and ensured every document received the same careful respect that had preserved it for generations. She often paused before opening the museum each day, resting her hand briefly against one of the original ceiling beams where the carved wheat emblem had first caught her attention. It reminded her how everything had begun with a simple moment of curiosity inside an abandoned cottage that no one else wanted. She never recovered the pension stolen through fraud. The investigations continued elsewhere. But the savings she had worked a lifetime to build never returned. That loss remained real. It always would. Yet over time, she stopped measuring her future by what had been taken from her. Instead, she measured it by what had unexpectedly been entrusted to her care. The little stone cottage purchased for $250 had become her home. The abandoned watermill had become a place of learning. The hidden archive had become a gift shared with an entire community. Most importantly, the people who once believed their ancestors had disappeared quietly from history could now see their names, photographs, journals, and acts of generosity remembered with dignity. Every evening, after the last visitors departed and the museum grew quiet once more, Margaret walked through the old press of memories preserved inside the mill before locking the doors. She would pause at the pantry, knowing the hidden cellar remained safely below. Then step outside to listen to the gentle sound of water flowing past the restored wheel. the valley no longer seemed defined by forgotten hardships or missing records. It had become a place where ordinary kindness finally received the place it had always deserved. Looking across the peaceful stream beneath the fading light, Margaret understood that the greatest treasure hidden beneath the miller's cottage had never been a collection of ledgers at all. It had been the enduring reminder that communities are built, sustained, and remembered not by wealth alone, but by countless ordinary people who quietly choose generosity when no one is watching, leaving behind the richest inheritance any generation can ever receive. Margaret's journey reminds us that life's greatest treasures are not always measured by the money we save or the possessions we own. Wealth can disappear in a single moment, but kindness, integrity, and the quiet compassion we show one another can echo across generations. The hidden ledger beneath the miller's cottage was never valuable because it recorded grain. It was valuable because it preserved proof that ordinary people chose generosity when times were hardest. Every family, every community, and every generation is shaped by countless unsung acts of goodness that rarely appear in history books. May this story inspire you to treasure your own family's memories. Honor the everyday people whose quiet sacrifices make our lives better. And remember that the most enduring legacy we can leave behind is not our fortune, but the kindness, hope, and humanity we pass on to others.